Hello. The episode you're about to listen to is part of a multi part series introducing an overview of Japanese history. This is a repeat of one of the original projects the History of Japan podcast was built on, and is intended to serve as an update and supplement to these original works. After 10 years, my hope is to return to this approach and to do it a little bit better given the skills that I have improved in the intervening years. If you haven't been doing so already, you should listen to these episodes sequentially, starting with episode 501. Without any further ado, enjoy the episode. Hello, and welcome to the History of Japan podcast, episode 530, Bakumatsu, Part 3. I imagine that if you plucked a random member of the Tokugawa Bakufu out of Edo Castle on the Lunar New Year of 1865, he'd probably be pretty confused about what was happening and also would not speak great English at best, so honestly, the conversation would be a bit tense. But assuming that none of that was an issue, our random member of the Bakufu, take, for example, Tokugawa Yoshinobu, one of the many relatives of the shogun floating about the halls of power and someone we'll return to in a bit, well, he'd probably be pretty happy. Sure, not everything was great. The unequal treaties were still an issue, and in particular, tensions were riding high about the promise to open Hyogo to foreign trade as a treaty port, which had been supposed to happen in 1863, but which had been repeatedly delayed because of objections from the imperial court about allowing a foreign presence that close to Kyoto. So no, things weren't perfect, but on balance, they could be a lot worse. And that's interesting, because if you did the exact same thing 2 years later, on the Lunar New Year of 1867, our Bakufu official would be absolutely panicking. Why is that? How did things go so wrong for the Tokugawa regime, which looked like it was finally turning things around with the dramatic downfall of its loyalist opposition? The answer begins in January of 1865 in the very same Choshu domain where we left things off last time. For a quick reminder, Choshu was one of 2 domains where the loyalist movement had been able to gather substantial steam, and the only one where it had taken control of the government. That hadn't really worked out great, though. Attempts by said loyalists to implement the expulsion of foreigners from Japan in 1863 resulted in a disastrous military defeat, and attempts to launch a coup and seize control of the emperor in 1864 ended in failure and military defeat at the hands of forces mobilized by the shogunate. Yet loyalism in Tosa was not dead. A great many of its adherents had simply fled into the countryside to escape both the shogunate and the pro-Tokugawa regime installed in Choshu's castle town of Hagi at the end of said punitive expedition. And in the winter of 1865, a few months after the end of the expedition and the withdrawal of the shogunate's forces, those loyalists returned with a vengeance. They were led by men like Takasugi Shinsaku, whom we talked about at the end of last week's episode. Takasugi was a samurai who had been an avid member of the loyalist movement. Among other things, he'd helped direct some of the efforts to close the Straits of Shimonoseki to foreign shipping at the start of the so-called foreign expulsion of 1863. In the aftermath, Takasugi pitched an idea to Choshu's loyalist leadership, which they ended up jumping on and which would prove pretty important going forward, something called the Kiheitai. That term roughly translates to something like irregulars. The Kiheitai were intended to be a mixed militia which included both samurai and, shockingly, some non-samurai as well, trained in Western-style infantry combat. This was not the first time this was done in Japan. Tosa domain in Shikoku had mobilized a similar mixed force, the Minpeitai, back in the 1850s. The core notion was not new in Choshu either. Takasugi's teacher, Yoshida Shoin, who himself had been executed on orders of the Bakufu during the purges of Ii Naosuke, had pushed for the adoption of Western infantry techniques to strengthen the domain military. This is probably a good point to remember that while imperial loyalism as an ideology was opposed to the forced opening of the country and the foreign presence in Japan, loyalists were not universally opposed to Western technology or innovations, the usefulness of which was hard to deny. At any rate, the most staunchly anti-foreign loyalists were largely dead after 1864. The Kihei-tai in the end proves its worth many times over. The reemergence of loyalists like Takasugi in January of 1865 triggered a civil war between adherents of the new pro-Tokugawa government, which had been installed a few months earlier, and those opposed to it. And the result was a decisive victory for the anti-Tokugawa side, spearheaded by Takasugi and his Kihei-tai. In particular, Takasugi was able to make use of the financial reserves the loyalists of Choshu still had to purchase a great many French and German-designed rifles to expand and equip his forces. In short order, he found another weapons dealer as well, because as the United States wrapped up its own civil war, the US federal government was keen to offload some of its wartime surplus and would find Choshu's loyalists an eager buyer. Takasugi and his political allies would, after crushing the pro-Tokugawa regime in Choshu, set about rebuilding the domain military and preparing it for what was certain to come next, a military response from the shogunate. And they would not have to wait long. Early in 1866, the Tokugawa Bakufu publicly announced a plan to mobilize for another punitive expedition targeting Choshu to return a pro-Tokugawa government to the domain. The plans to do this had been under consideration pretty much as soon as fighting broke out again in Choshu in 1865, but initially they hadn't been announced because the shogunate was hoping that the rebels could be defeated without yet another expensive military campaign. But when that proved not to be the case, Tokugawa Iemochi himself took up residence in Osaka Castle to direct a new campaign against Choshu. Admittedly, this was more of a symbolic gesture than anything, since Iemochi was all of 20 by this point, and had never, actually commanded an army or something like that. But still, rolling out the shogun for the occasion was proof this was being taken seriously. Mobilization, though, took time, until the early summer of 1866, as the various domains around Choshu were ordered to muster their forces and get ready for a four-front attack on the domain, and as the Bakufu mustered its own fighters. The result, frankly, was kind of a train wreck. Everything took forever to come together, first because the shogunate wanted an order from the emperor approving the attack to cover his political bases, which the court was reluctant to give. Unity in the face of the foreign threat was the order of the day in Kyoto, but they did give in eventually. But by then, a bunch of the feudal domains tapped to join the assault were expressing a little less enthusiasm about a war which they saw, frankly correctly, as intended to strengthen the hand of the Tokugawa shogun without benefiting them. And then the whole thing was delayed further because all of those delays saw massive numbers of soldiers gathering in central Japan with nothing to do. The cost of feeding them sent food prices skyrocketing, causing a bunch of food riots which further delayed everything. But by June of 1866, the pieces were in place, only for the actual campaign to somehow manage to be an even bigger train wreck. Seriously, the planned attacks from the east and north over land and from the west and south by sea were beaten on every single front, and resoundingly so. How could the shogunate lose that badly? Well, the answer has been debated and studied to death, and there's some pretty clear consensus on the major reasons. One, of course, was the logistical delays, which gave the Choshu loyalists' defenders a lot more time to dig in and drill with their fancy new American, German, and French guns. On the flip side, nobody in the Tokugawa shogunate had really run a substantial military campaign against determined opposition in about 2 centuries. Even the previous Choshu expedition had seen their opponents fold with pretty minimal fighting. Coordinating the attack and doing so over both the shogunate's own forces and all the feudal domains involved from 4 different lines of assault would be a daunting prospect for any commander. Second, Choshu's military forces were way more up to date than most Tokugawa planners realized, both in terms of the Kihei-tai and because the domain had purchased several steamships mostly from the United Kingdom, which proved very successful in the sea fighting. Third, many of the domains mobilized by the shogunate were pretty half-hearted in their participation, delaying their mobilization, sending smaller detachments than they were supposed to, or in some cases just outright refusing to partake in the whole fight. For some domains, that was a question of finance, after all, war is expensive. For others, it was concern over the long-term goals of the shogunate. Why launch a second expedition to replace the government of a domain? Wasn't the whole grand bargain of the Tokugawa shogunate that the daimyo and the domains could do pretty much what they wanted as long as they didn't break any of Edo's rules? Choshu had broken those rules during the first go-round, but what had they done to deserve war this time? More than a few daimyo began to wonder if this wasn't just some prelude to clamping down on all of their rights in the name of national crisis, if the Tokugawa shogunate wasn't looking to centralize its power at their expense. Most important for Choshu's victory, though, was the revelation that one of the wealthiest domains that was supposed to support the attack, Satsuma down in southern Kyushu, would not, and had in fact already signed a secret alliance with Choshu Domain. We've talked about Satsuma a lot over the last few months, almost as if I was doing some kind of deliberate foreshadowing. It was one of the outsider domains that had submitted to the shogunate after the Battle of Sekigahara, but its remote location in the south of Kyushu had protected the ruling family, the Shimazu, from much retaliation for backing the wrong side. Its samurai had still hung on, though, to a pretty deep resentment of Tokugawa rule. Still, Satsuma was not a loyalist hotspot. The Shimazu family and their retainers had generally solidified around the position of Kobu Gattai, the unity of the shogunate and the imperial court, which was a hallmark of more moderate policy in the 1860s. So why side with Choshu now? Well, partially sheer practicality. Satsuma Domain's leadership, by this point increasingly dominated by an enigmatic advisor named Saigo Takamori, had become increasingly concerned the shogunate was moving away from a moderate position, that the second Choshu expedition was an indicator that the Tokugawa regime was not going to compromise, but was in fact looking to become more powerful than ever, and in the bargain to strip wealthy domains like Satsuma of their independence. In addition, the meeting which resulted in the secret alliance between these domains, which had been rivals by the way going back to the pre-Tokugawa days, was mediated by a third party, a fascinating samurai who proved a very successful negotiator, Sakamoto Ryoma of Tosa Domain. Now, there's both a lot I could say and not much to say about Sakamoto Ryoma. On the one hand, he lives very large in the memory of this time, but on the other, it's quite possible to tell the tale of the end of the shogunate without directly referencing him, because his actual role, again, is more as a mediator in this alliance, and it would only be in much later years that his contribution was so emphasized. But if you engage with basically any popular media about this time period, you are probably going to encounter his name, so I'd feel remiss not mentioning it at all. Sakamoto had been a die-hard loyalist in his native Tosa, even going so far as to flee the domain and become a ronin to join the cause in Kyoto. But by the time he did, Matsudaira Katamori's crackdown in the city was in full swing, and so Sakamoto headed instead to Edo, where he planned to assassinate a prominent figure in the Bakufu. That figure, Katsu Kaishu, had become prominent as an advocate for naval reform. He first entered public life as the pilot of the Kanren Maru, the first screw-driven steam warship purchased by the shogunate, which had carried the embassy sent by the shogunate to America in 1860 to ratify the Harris Treaty. He's also, by the by, the son of Katsu Kokichi, who we talked about a few episodes back. Katsu Kokichi was that samurai who spent much of his life as a dissolute gambler, and whose autobiography, translated in English as Musui's Story, is a great look into the seedier side of Edo period life. But that's not really relevant here, it's just fun. Sakamoto's plan to assassinate Katsu Kaishu went awry when Katsu, seeing his assassin coming, simply asked for a moment to explain himself, and Sakamoto gave it to him. Supposedly, and this story is heavily mythologized, so it's hard to know for sure what happened, Katsukaishu appealed to Sakamoto's patriotic sensibilities, saying he did what he did only because he felt he had to protect the country from Western depredation, that yes, he was accepting of the unequal treaties, but he was also a patriot like Sakamoto. Theirs was not a difference of ideals, but emphasis. Katsu was convinced the foreign threat couldn't be immediately defeated, and so strengthening the nation and biding your time was the order of the day. And Sakamoto was convinced by this, so convinced that he became Katsu's bodyguard, protecting the man in turn from future assassination attempts. Now again, we don't know how true the story is, but it is a wild and famous one, and I do think it gives some insight into Sakamoto's mindset as a figure, because from what we can tell, while the details might have been mythologized, the actual encounter did happen. This is also why Sakamoto had the clout to help broker a Satsuma Choshu alliance. Talks over that alliance had been going on as far back as 1865, but had broken down repeatedly given both political differences. Both domains were worried about the power of the shogunate but didn't really agree on strategy, and their long-standing rivalry, which again goes back to the 1500s. Sakamoto, though, was a neutral third party given his background in Tosa, and his reputation as a man of honesty, willing to hear out those he disagreed with, meant he was respected by everyone involved. And so Sakamoto could serve as an intermediary to cut the actual alliance, which established tacit Satsuma support for Choshu and the promise of outright military support down the line, and an agreement that both domains would exert themselves in the name of restoring the emperor to power. That alliance, in turn, was hugely important for the outcome of the Second Choshu Expedition as it's known. Satsuma was one of the wealthiest domains in the country and the biggest one mobilized to fight against Choshu, and when its leadership declined to participate in the second round of fighting and instead started sending weapons to Choshu, well, that tips the balance of power pretty substantially, doesn't it? And as a result, the Tokugawa shogunate suffered its first military defeat, well, pretty much since its founding, and that's bad. The German sociologist Max Weber once defined political power as, in essence, growing out of state control of violence, or as he put it, quote, "A compulsory political organization with continuous operations will be called a state if, and insofar as its administrative staff successfully upholds a claim to the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force in the enforcement of its order." I think my phrasing is a bit better, personally. Anyway, what Weber is basically saying here is that political order is based on the threat of violence. That when you obey traffic laws, for example, you do so because you know that if you don't, you might be fined or even arrested, and that if you resist that, you might even be subdued by force, which the people around you will accept as a legitimate result of your rule-breaking. Choshu had broken the rules. The Bakufu had tried to punish them, and instead it had gotten its butt kicked. It had proven that it could not enforce the rules by force anymore in an atmosphere where people were already questioning its legitimacy. It shouldn't really surprise anyone that, frankly, things went downhill from there. After Choshu's victory, domains around Japan began openly defying the shogunate's rules. For example, Western merchants in the treaty ports began to do booming trades in weapons as domain governments armed themselves for a civil war. And that was illegal under Bakufu law. The shogunate was supposed to control the foreign trade, but who was gonna stop him? And as a real cherry on top of this whole mess, right towards the tail end of the fighting, word came that Tokugawa Iemochi, the 14th Tokugawa shogun, had died unexpectedly in Osaka Castle on August 29, 1866, at the tender age of 20. The cause of his death remains contested. It's often suggested to be beriberi caused by the shogun's heavily vegan diet, but we simply don't know, and frankly it doesn't really even matter. Before his death, Iemochi had suggested a distant relative, a 3-year-old cousin, as his heir, but literally everybody else in the Bakufu rejected the idea of putting a 3-year-old in charge during a crisis, and so Iemochi's old competitor for the gig got the nod. Tokugawa Yoshinobu, who back in 1858 had been the other candidate for the job of shogun, but who had not been chosen because the then Tairo Inosuke had thought the 21-year-old Yoshinobu would not be as pliable as the young boy Iemochi, was now the shogun. And Iemochi were both dead. Yoshinobu was 29, and he did not have an enviable task before him as the 15th Tokugawa shogun. When word of new defeats and even the loss of a major shogunate stronghold in Kokura in northern Kyushu reached him, he decided to call an end to hostilities with Choshu. He did so despite the fact that Emperor Komei, who still had not forgiven Choshu's loyalists for trying to burn his capital down, was furious and wanted the domain punished. Yoshinobu was able to convince the emperor that the Bakufu's military position was not tenable, but still, not what you'd call an auspicious start. Shortly after this decision, Iemochi's death was officially announced. It took 29 days for the Bakufu to do that, to give time to wind up the fighting against Choshu without demoralizing its frontline troops. In fact, the shogunate technically said the mourning period for Iemochi was the reason it was ending fighting, not that this subterfuge fooled anyone. So this isn't great, but Yoshinobu's not incompetent, and the shogunate still had one staunch supporter, and in a certain sense the one who mattered the most. Emperor Komei was a xenophobic nationalist, but also a conservative. Unlike the loyalists who rebelled in his domain, he did not want fundamental change or to get rid of the shogunate. He simply wanted its relationship to the court changed. He remained adamant about this even after the death of Tokugawa Iemochi, when some of his more extreme courtiers began begging him to take power from the shogunate given the ongoing national emergency. But Komei remained firm and even accused those who lobbied him to do this of treason, since they were more focused on the shogunate than the real problem, the unequal treaties and Western imperialism. Komei was staunch in this stance until suddenly, around the time of the new year, he got sick. About 1 week after Tokugawa Yoshinobu officially came to Kyoto to receive the title of shogun. The story goes that on January 16, 1867, the emperor began to feel seriously unwell during a performance of kagoda dances. He'd had symptoms for a bit, but his doctors had diagnosed it as a cold. 2 days later, he was bedridden. 2 days after that, his doctors announced that he had smallpox, which he had contracted from a page named Fujimaru, who had taken ill with the disease, but recovered and returned to the palace. Komei briefly recovered, but on January 30th, took a serious turn for the worse, and over the course of several hours of agony, passed away. That's the official story, but it has been questioned for about as long as it has existed. For one thing, smallpox is very virulent. In the age before it was wiped out by vaccination, it would spread like wildfire and was a killer, which is why you should all get your shots. Vaccination saves lives. So it's weird that only Komei got sick, and he got sick from someone who had recovered from smallpox. Usually they're not infectious anymore. And wouldn't you know it? It's also weird that smallpox has a lot of symptoms in common with arsenic poisoning. And so a rumor has persisted down to this day that Emperor Komei was assassinated. Who would do that? Well, there's a lot of theories. Perhaps a courtier who saw the emperor as an impediment to a plan to get rid of the shogunate. For example, one of the ones Komei accused of treason for being so concerned with doing just that. Perhaps it was someone who saw the emperor's anti-foreignism as likely to provoke an unwinnable war with the West. Many names have been bandied about, but we have no proof at all, and Japan's modern imperial household agency is famously reticent to let anyone root around an imperial tomb, so without the chance to actually test Komei's body for arsenic residue, there's really no way to know. Komei's death meant the throne passed to his only surviving child, the boy prince Mutsuhito, who at the tender age of 15 was everything his father was not, rather unset in his ways and pliable to the influence of his advisors. Most people don't know Mutsuhito, though. He's better known by his Renyo name and the name that would be given to the period of his time on the throne, Meiji. The Meiji emperor, unlike his father, had no strong attachments to the Tokugawa shogunate. Indeed, up until this point, he hadn't really been involved in politics at all, with a traditional upbringing that focused on providing the future emperor with an education in traditional arts and Confucian philosophy. And that wasn't unreasonable. Emperor Kolmei had come to the throne young. He was only 36 when he died. It's understandable he hadn't really planned for his son to take over yet, but it did mean that the father's staunchly conservative worldview was not carried forward by the son. The first year of the new emperor's reign was one of tense standoffs. Though radicals at court now had a far more pliable ruler on the throne, many were hesitant to push too hard too fast. It was not yet clear whether the strength of the Tokugawa shogunate was totally exhausted. Choshu and its newly declared ally in Satsuma, meanwhile, were busily negotiating with the shogunate, now from a position of power, as to what the long-term arrangement of power would be in Japan given the events of the past year. In the interests of time, and since I am once again behind where I plan to be, I will spare you the back and forth of those negotiations. In the end, in November of 1867, Tokugawa Yoshinobu caved in. In that month, he would gather the daimyo assembled in Kyoto, where he'd remained since the disastrous campaign of the previous year, at Nijo Castle, once the bastion of Tokugawa authority in the emperor's city. There, the shogun Yoshinobu would announce that he was both abdicating and returning his powers to the imperial throne, that the age of the Tokugawa shoguns was coming to an end. One has to imagine this was not an easy moment for him. We haven't talked about Yoshinobu a lot up till now because of time constraints, but he'd been in the political mix for over a decade by this point. His whole adult life had been wrapped up in trying to safeguard Tokugawa rule. Even after he didn't get the job of shogun, he'd served in the upper level of the Bakufu leadership and had even been one of Iemochi's trusted advisors and point men for some pretty delicate issues, most notably its negotiations with the imperial court. Yoshinobu had put so much of his time, life, and energy into the Tokugawa Bakufu, had been given responsibility for its future, and now he was presiding over its end. I should note, though, that Yoshinobu's long-term plan here remains a subject of some dispute. It's very clear that the Tokugawa shogunate no longer commanded the authority or respect it did even a year earlier. Its ability to marshal the daimyo around Japan to fight on its behalf had clearly been hindered by the disastrous war with Choshu. On the other hand, much of its own forces remained intact, and given the relative size of the shogunate's old landholding, that was a pretty substantial army, including a small modern navy and a contingent of modern-style infantry trained by officers hired from France. Yoshinobu, in other words, was not powerless. He still had a place to bargain from, so why give up? Maybe he didn't really give up. When he abdicated, he also circulated a proposal for what the new government of Japan could look like in the aftermath of the shogunate. Under Yoshinobu's proposed new regime, the emperor would be restored as a head of state. In other words, he would play the same role that, say, the monarchy does in the United Kingdom, where the king serves as a figurehead and symbol of state authority, and still has some fun powers here and there, but doesn't, actually run the country anymore. Actual lawmaking authority would go to a bicameral legislature. First would come an upper house composed of daimyo, who would form an assembly broadly similar, to return to the same metaphor, to the House of Lords in the United Kingdom, or at least how it used to work. Daimyo would have hereditary seats to pass down to their heirs. Second would be an elected lower house of one samurai from each feudal domain. Together, this deliberative assembly would shape the policies that would determine Japan's future. But we're missing something here. As you might remember from your grade school civics classes, this is just one type of governmental authority, legislative power, the ability to set policy. Who would wield executive authority? Who would preside over this parliament of daimyo and serve as the head of government, the actual implementer of policy? To return to the UK metaphor, who would be the prime minister? Why, the daimyo with the single largest landholding would. And remember, the Tokugawa shoguns held north of 3 million koku of land, easily the single largest holding in all of Japan, and Yoshinobu pointedly didn't give his land back to the emperor in the same way he gave the shogun's authority back to the emperor. This proposal suggests that basically Yoshinobu was hoping he could restore the emperor and give up the shogunate to quiet the dissenters, while at the same time securing more power for himself than any of his predecessors as shogun had ever held. He could be the executive of a more centralized national government than Japan had ever possessed before in its history, which frankly is a pretty clever maneuver on his part. But of course, it didn't really work out that way. Yoshinobu's proposal was never considered by the imperial court. For 2 months after his abdication, the court dithered as to next steps. You see, even among the most ardent advocates of imperial restoration, nobody actually had practice governing a country, and nobody had really put that much thought into what came after you overthrew the shogun. So they'd restored the emperor. Now what? Nobody quite knew. In the end, an ad hoc advisory council to the throne, composed of politically active daimyo and members of the court nobility, took power into their own hands, and that council would, in early January of 1868, turn decisively against Yoshinobu. Led by loyalists from Satsuma and Choshu, the council determined that the shogun was not being honest, that he was giving up power in the hopes he could secure even more of it. On January 5th, 1868, a proclamation from the Meiji Emperor was issued to Yoshinobu, which accepted his abdication and declared that the now former shogun had to return all of his land to the imperial court. Yoshinobu, still in Nijo Castle in Kyoto and outnumbered by the loyalists, especially from Satsuma and Choshu, that had swarmed the city in the wake of their victory, agreed, but requested some time to prepare an announcement to his followers lest they take it poorly. He then withdrew from Kyoto and Nijo Castle and relocated to Osaka, along with those pro-Tokugawa daimyo still in the city. In a somewhat comical twist, just a few days after leaving Kyoto with the news he was to give up all of his land, Yoshinobu got another message from the imperial court. That message said the first anniversary of Emperor Komei's death was coming up, but the court was also bankrupt and couldn't afford to pay for the funerary observances, and so Yoshinobu was asked to cover the costs. Which, to his credit, he did do. The anniversary ceremonies went forward just 4 days before Yoshinobu and the imperial court went to war. You see, while in Osaka Castle, Yoshinobu had a change of heart. Why precisely, we don't know. Perhaps as soon as he had left Kyoto, he had planned to make a fight of things. Perhaps hardliners in his camp convinced him. Regardless, in mid-January, he sent a letter to the imperial court objecting to its proclamation that its powers had been restored. That letter insisted that Yoshinobu hoped to build a new regime based on peace and justice, but that the emperor's court had fallen under the control of renegades from Choshu and Satsuma, as well as extremists from the court partial to imperial loyalism, people whom the former Emperor Komei, to whom Yoshinobu proclaimed undivided loyalty, had proclaimed traitors. And now these traitors were corrupting the court and the boy emperor with their extremism. As he wrote, quote, "Even supposing these changes originate with the emperor, is it not our duty as loyal subjects to remonstrate with him? It must be said, moreover, that the signs of disorder in the country have their origins in the youth of the present emperor. This is especially the case in foreign relations. If they, the traitors, twist the wishes of the emperor and deal with foreign countries on the basis of temporary expedients, they will lose the trust of other countries and do great harm to the imperial land." Sides were being drawn for a battle, and just a few days later the spark arrived. Word arrived from Edo that the outer works of the shogun's castle had caught fire. Bakufu leaders in the city blamed Satsuma for this. To be fair, there was reason to do that. The same day as the fire, Satsuma samurai had attacked the fortified mansion of Shonai Domain, a pro-Tokugawa fiefdom which helped police Edo. And so 2 days later, Satsuma's own compound in Edo had been stormed by pro-shogunate forces, resulting in a pitched battle that burned the compound to the ground. When news of this made it to Osaka, the pro-Tokugawa forces in the city were furious, and Yoshinobu decided to mobilize them on January 25th, march to Kyoto, and rescue the emperor from evil influences. On January 27th, the shogun's army met a loyalist force at a pair of crossings just south of Kyoto at Toba and Fushimi. The shogunate's army outnumbered their opponents, mostly from Satsuma and Choshu, both of which had marched troops into the city after Yoshinobu's departure, by a ratio of 3-1, but in a series of attacks that lasted until January 31st, the defenders were the ones who prevailed. And when the shogunate's forces retreated, they found that several formerly friendly domains along their line of retreat were now opposed to them. A few even fired on the retreating army. And this really was the end of Tokugawa rule. Shortly thereafter, Yoshinobu would flee Osaka by boat and give up command of its forces. Edo itself would surrender a few months later, its garrison giving up without a fight to a newly coined Imperial Japanese Army. Pro-Tokugawa domains would keep the fight going through 1868 in what is now called the Boshin War, so named for the designation of 1868 as the year of the wooden dragon, or Boshin, in the 60-year zodiac cycle. A few final holdouts in Hokkaido would even make it a good ways to 1869. But after the Battle of Toba Fushimi, it was clear who was going to win. The shogunate was finished, a new government was now in charge. But what was that government gonna do? Nobody was quite sure, and shaking out the nature of the new Japan would prove far more challenging than anyone initially realized. That's a story for next time, though. That's all for this week. Thank you very much for listening. This show is a part of the Facing Backward podcast network. You can find out more about this show and our other shows at facingbackward.com, and you can support the network at patreon.com/facingbackward. Special thanks to those who have given at our shoutout tier: Jan Leonard, Stephen Elkins, Martin Oliveira, Clark Canning, Ian Kellett, Matt Haynes, Jackie Frostocker, Monkey Sack, Alayla McCulloch, Karen Murphy, Peter Wales, Robert Prine, William Arno, Jonas Brandis, Nicholas Kroll, Jerry Spinrad, Jared Stevens, Jeffrey Dwork, Stefan Hrushka, Joshua Kane, Robbie and Kat, Jacob Key, Aaron Finkbeiner, and Anonymous Anna's Hummingbird, Mark Sai, Gil, Leslie Ikuta, Trash Taste Enjoyer, John, Christopher, Harrison Reese, Inoue Enryo's Ghostbusters, NihongoKaizen.com, Shimao Toshio's History of Japonesia podcast, Jennifer Pianzio, James, A House is a Perfectly Cromulent Mascot, The Fish I Catch Are Rhodes Scholars Compared to Samuel Alito, Schmuck, and Everything Changed When the Fire Nation Attacked. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next time as we figure out, now that we've made the new Japan, what is the new Japan?